My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, the evil that men do lives after them, in the Maze of Neuromin.
Our first segment is a basic crawl.
The Maze of Neuromin is a 14-page starter adventure for Bluehome, published in 2013 by Dreamscape Design, with writing by Justin Becker, editing by Michael Thomas, and public domain art by Harry Clark and Caspar David Friedrich. The Necropolis of Neuromin is the expanded version, now 22 pages, released in 2019 and available as a pay-what-you-want PDF on DriveThru RPG. In this adventure, the characters are seeking Law's End, a town of terrible debaucheries and rituals, laid low when the necromancer who founded the town, Nuromen the Black, got a little carried away with his magical experiments. The characters are hoping to find and explore an underground maze beneath the ruins of Law's End. And we'll note here that the Maze of Neuromin is not actually a maze or labyrinth, but more of an underground keep and connected cave system. Anyway, onto the contents.
The book starts with a map of the first level of the maze. From there, we get a history of Nuromen and the town of Law's End. Next is an encounter with a group of wood elves standing vigil near the ruins of Law's End, and hoping to convince the player characters to retrieve the crown of their prince who attempted to negotiate with Nuromen back in the day and was murdered for his trouble. From there we get a summary of Law's End and the maze itself, plus a wandering monster table. Then comes the first level of the dungeon proper, which contains 14 keyed locations. Some highlights include a broken entry shaft and underground river, an enormous underground courtyard, a haunted wine vault, a grand banqueting hall that is also the lair of some harpies, a beautiful overgrown grotto that actually looks out the side of the hill the maze is buried in, Nuromen's apartments, where we get to see a softer side of the evil necromancer, Nuromen's study and laboratory, which is guarded by a magic door, and a torture room called the Chamber of Misery. Next is level 2 of the dungeon, which contains 10 keyed locations. Highlights there include the Hall of Statues, the Underground Lake, Cave of the Magic Bones, a temple to an evil multi-limbed god, ancestral burial crypts, and the Vault of Nuromen. The book ends with a map of the second level of the dungeon. Tom, how have you used either Maze of Neuromin or the updated Necropolis of Neuromin?
Right, well, I used the revised Necropolis version, although since the additions are kind of at the beginning and end of the scenario, more context in the land around the dungeon. In fact, I think I basically used the same bit you did if you used Maze, because I was running Stars Without Number, and it was a bounty hunting location where the space ruffian crew were looking for some outlaws. So the Goblins was actually the name of a band of space outlaws, and I had their hideout be inside. Well, no, they weren't hiding out. They were looking for space treasure inside the dungeon. And I should also note at this point, by the way, quick disclaimer, I am a friend and erstwhile gaming buddy of Michael Thomas, the author of Bluehome and editor of this book. So bear that in mind if anyone thinks I'm soft-pedaling criticism. Anyway, how about you, Jason? What did you do with it?
I ran the Maze of Neuromin over the course of 3 sessions using Trophy Gold.
Nice.
Things we liked about Nuromin. Maze, Necropolis, or otherwise. Let's focus on Maze. Things we liked. I think I want to start with this sort of surface level stuff, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the public domain art that it uses feels surprisingly coherent throughout the whole thing. It never quite feels like it was crafted for the module, because in fact it wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
But it's lovely to look at and very consistent across the entire book, so I appreciated that. I think that's sometimes tricky to do with public domain art. I think the maps are very nice.
Mm-hmm.
The layout is quite clean and functional. Overall, it's a good-looking module. I would say pretty simple in presentation, but that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, it's all very clean and clear. And I think you're right. It's sort of obviously the art is all by the same artist inside that, and was chosen, I think, from a coherent set anyway that's now in the public domain. That's a great choice, right? And details of the pictures do surprisingly, or rather perhaps not surprisingly, I think the prose has been tweaked to match the illustrations later, but it does go with what's in the text, which is great. There's something about this style and the style of Bluehome in general that I really appreciate. It's sort of, what I kind of think of as the craftsmanship end of the OSR. So it's not like retro gaming. It's not trying to be gritty. It's not trying to be art punky and edgy. It's just this. Everything's kind of like just so, like someone's made a model railway with loads of little trees and fixed them all in the right place. Do you know what I mean?
I saw your note on this idea of the craftsmanship end of the OSR, and it took me a minute to sort of conceptualize what you're talking about, but I think I get it, because the movement right now, the OSR movement right now, is so that art punk, crazy wild layouts, worlds that feel like they sort of just sprung up out of nowhere. Like, it's a different feeling, I think, than classic D&D. And so I get the difference there. I'm curious, like, the distinction you're making between retro clones in this, because it felt retro cloney to me.
Well, I mean, it absolutely is Blue Home is a retro clone of Holmes D&D for sure. But I think what I mean by that is a lot of the time you have the opposite end from the art punkers is this sort of semi-obsession with, like, how many hirelings do you need and torches burning out and so on. And this kind of grim and gritty, well, not exactly gritty, but yeah, that sort of nuts and boltsy thing. Whereas this is more like, it feels to me the way illustrations in Boys' Own Adventure books or stories of Knights of the Round Table from the 60s looked in their illustrations. It's that kind of quite crisp and clean knights in armor and wizards, and yet still, you know, it's got silly bits in it. It's got weird aliens in the Blue Home book because. So it's not entirely like po-faced, but it is that sort of quite primary colours almost, kind of, well, actually no, watercolours. Everything's painted in watercolours, let's put it that way.
I think I know what you mean. There's something about Blue Home, this adventure, which is what we're focused on, but also Blue Home more generally, that really is kind of embracing this older idea of what it meant to make a dungeon. I don't know if that makes any sense, but, you know, like when I sit and I think about what is an old school dungeon, you know, like a pre-2E dungeon, this is kind of what I think of. Yeah. And I don't know if it's because like Blue Home like uses that particular shade of blue throughout that is kind of used on the old blue dungeon maps that Gygax used or whatever, but it definitely has this like sort of, it's this throwback feel, but it's not just a throwback for the sake of throwbacks. Like, I think it's really genuinely trying to explore something that was there in this like classic presentation. It rises above like mere nostalgia to occupy something more like, this is what it was like, right? It's not just like, oh, rose tinted glasses. It's more like, this is a thing. This is what an old dungeon was like, and this is how it was constructed. And that's actually one of the things I really like about it. It has so many classic elements. A lot of it's very Tolkien-esque, which is especially in terms of the themes that it plays with. But a lot of like just the sort of set dressing and the details is very classically D&D. I mean, you have wood elves, you have goblins, you have gelatinous cubes, you have harpies. You're exploring a necromancer's lair. There's a wizard's tower. There's a talking door. There's a laboratory. Yeah. You know, like it just has all that like D&D stuff. And sometimes you want that. So I ran this for a group of people who kind of came to the hobby like more recently. A lot of them got into trophy or they sort of got into more indie type stuff, and they kind of missed the whole like classic D&D thing. And one of the things that they all told me in terms of the feedback I got after we were done was, I felt like I got the classic D&D experience. I feel like I've experienced something that I know about from pop culture. And I think that's to the module's credit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose it's worth mentioning as well that this adventure actually predates Blue Home as a thing and was written for just Holmes D&D, which is, of course, kind of the same thing, right? Blue Home is just like,
right, yeah.
What if Holmes D&D was slightly better organized and explained and also went up to level 20? And then Michael Thomas got permission to make it into a Blue Home thing. It was deliberately done to make a Holmesy adventure that people could download and play by Justin Becker. That's my understanding anyway. And it really does that. But also, it does go beyond that. And if you look at the dungeon map and stuff, so the structure is nice. It's not a funnel. Even in the good old days, the bad old days of linear dungeon design, that was a thing. And this doesn't fall into that trap. And also, you mentioned Tolkien-esque, and I think that's really important. The text, like the things that are going on, the descriptions, the backstory that you can discover and see for yourself when you're exploring this dungeon, has these Tolkien-esque themes. So the things you're doing are not Tolkien-esque, you're grubbing around for treasure, whatever. But you can still enjoy that kind of sense of loss and decay and corruption in the past, because it's a crumbling ruin. Things went wrong. This was a guy who was evil, but he was a magnificent wizard. And yeah, that sort of theme of tragic romance, which is in Tolkien a lot, although, let's be honest, they're not quite as well realised as the other bits of Tolkien's writing. It's not one of those adventures where the theme is really writ large, but when you do run it or play it, it really comes through in a way that knits everything together and just makes it much more memorable and engaging and interesting than it would be if it was just like, your list is correct. Harpies at a feasting table, goblins who are knocking around, underground rivers. You could check those things off on a list and stick them in a long corridor with doors coming off it. That wouldn't be anywhere near as good as this actually is.
Yeah, the Tolkien-esque elements definitely elevated. I think you're right about that for sure. And it felt that way in play too. Let's compare it to Tomb of Horrors, okay? Tomb of Horrors, that's a classic D&D module also.
Yeah.
But it's horrible. It's like genuinely bad. And there's lots of reasons why it's bad, but one of the main reasons why it's bad is because there's no story. There's kind of like nothing going on in this dungeon. There's an evil demi-lich, okay? And nothing else in the dungeon makes any sense together. There's no ecology to it. There's no backstory to it. Maze of Neuromin actually has a history. It feels lived in. You see evidence of it being lived in. And you can explore that backstory and pick up on some of those themes that it's playing with just naturally as the characters are playing through it. But it also has the trappings of D&D. And so I think it accomplishes two really big things there. And it's successful. It feels great in play. Something I like about this module a lot, it's a kind of a related point, but slightly different, which is there is a really nice, balanced, and logical flow to the narrative of this dungeon, or the implied narrative, or the narrative you're meant to discover and kind of pass through, as well as the sorts of things you're going to be encountering and doing. This piggybacks off the idea of it being very classically D&D, but there's a flow to it that just feels really good. Like, you have some above ground adventuring, you have an encounter with some wood elves who give you a mission, very classic D&D kind of thing. There's a negotiation, you get some ruins to explore, you go down a dark shaft, there's an underground river, you get lots of, as I've mentioned already, classic monsters and things and puzzles and traps. It's like a nicely laid out, well-balanced experience. You're kind of getting everything. There's a wizard's laboratory, there's a temple, it's got so much stuff. And it's got everything. It's like everything you could want in a D&D adventure
pretty
in this module. But it never feels forced. It never feels overdone or overwrought. It's just sort of like the greatest hits of D&D in one dungeon. And there's an appeal to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have just one more thing I want to say about something I really enjoyed. It's a small thing, but I'm a sucker for an underground lake. I just love an underground lake. It is right up there with creepy occult villagers and decadent noble masquerade party for me, of things I love to do in fantasy gaming. I love an underground lake, and this is a really good one. We talked about this when we did Sailors of the Starless Sea. There's something about an underground lake as a strange liminal space where you're in this darkness, you're underground, but there's water, you can't see anything, but you are still trying to traverse it to reach this island, usually in the middle of the underground lake where something really cryptic and weird and strange is going to happen. I love an underground lake. It's just such an alien thing that exists in the real world, and that's very appealing to me. It's just so fun to do. And so I'm just shout out to underground lakes in adventures.
Good.
I wish that was the trope instead of bug people and armillary spheres.
Although now you've mentioned it, there's a few underground lakes around, aren't there? So Sailors on the Starless Sea, Cult of the Reptile God, that's got an underground lake in it.
Does indeed, yeah.
I think, but yeah, you're right. This is where we start our campaign for more underground lakes.
More underground lakes, please. Anything else you want to say about things you liked?
Yeah, actually, I do want to call back on the physical arrangement of the dungeon, because we were talking about theme and feel and so on. But yeah, you're right. It's a really good place to move around. This is going to sound weird talking about a dungeon, but you feel like you're free to kind of come in and go out of different parts of the dungeon as you want. And there's sort of the parts are connected in interesting ways, like the classic swept away in an underground river and you find yourself in a troglodyte lair, that kind of thing. It sort of feels, it has that fun combination of making informed choices about where you're going next, or whether you're stopping and going back to the surface, getting supplies, but also with some fun shortcuts and things in it, which is always, I think, a hallmark of a good dungeon.
Yeah, that's actually worth seconding. the way that you access the second level of the dungeon from the first level of the dungeon is really cool because there's multiple ways you can do it, various secret doors and secret corridors and hidden hatches. And depending on which one your characters find, it really changes the flow of the story, right? Like depending on which one they find and where they end up on the second level, it really changes the whole dynamic of that sort of back half of the dungeon. So yeah, I totally agreed. It has this nice, like, fit together quality. You're right about that. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, things we had questions about. I had a couple. How did you feel about the grotto and the apartments, and in particular the softer side of Nuromen, so that listeners have the proper context here? There's this section where it's like this lovely overgrown grotto, and you can find the sort of bedroom or living quarters of Nuromen and his family, and you get like some evidence that he really cared a lot about his daughter and his wife, and the daughter's name is even like the secret password for one of the puzzle doors. My thought was that Justin intended for this to be a sort of narrative twist. You're meant to be thinking like, ooh, evil necromancer, the town was destroyed, look at all their debauchery and crazy experiments and da-da-da. And then you get to this part and you're like, oh, but he maybe was not so bad after all. That felt like the intention. But I also wondered if it was added in to make the quite romantic Harry Clark illustrations make more sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. But I think we can clear Justin on this front. Well, hang on, no. First of all, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's like an emotional twist, isn't it? Mm-hmm. It sort of makes me think of sort of a Clark Ashton Smithy kind of thing, about a powerful wizard who realised too late that he'd let his true love go, and then he tries to send his brain back in time or something, and even worse things happen. But yeah, spoiler for about 50% of Clark Ashton Smith's short stories there, everyone. Not really. So yeah, that's definitely a thing. That's a bit of not heroic romantic fantasy writing, I suppose. But the thing about the art, I think that's actually the other way round, because if you go to Justin's blog, The Forbidden Mazes of the Fenerac. Good luck Googling that, everyone.
I wonder if they're actual mazes.
Possibly. I mean... Anyway, so the original version that he published pre-Blueholme didn't have any of that artwork. It had like a few slightly different things. I think like the god is in the temple is given a name, and it's not the multi-arm thing or whatever. But it does have that little subplot about the wife and daughter and so on. So I think perhaps what's happened is Michael has spotted that thread and kind of gone, I can match that to this artwork.
Got it. That's the other way around. It chose the art based off the content. Yeah. That's good. Yeah, no, I can buy that. Yeah. My other question was about that god. I was trying to sort out whether this god that is apparently what Nuromen worshipped, it's this 8-armed baboon god of death or something. I was trying to suss out whether that was like an actual god in some other kind of fiction, or like a real world culture maybe, or perhaps something from an old D&D book, or was that just made up for the module? Do you know anything about that?
I strongly suspect it's made up for the module, because they do note several times that it's unknown in the local realm or something like that, don't they?
Right, yeah, because they never name it.
Yeah. So I think it's meant to be like a hook for some future adventure for the GM.
A mystery or something, yeah. That makes sense. Okay. Let's go to the Chain Lightning round. Tom, kick us off.
Okay, context free. The contraptions are quite worthless as they are incomprehensible.
Of the ghostly encounter in the wine vault, the ghost does not attack. It will drink from the cup, but the wine flows through its immaterial gullet and splashes on the floor. The spirit will then proffer the cup to the characters. Should any of them drink, they will turn ghostly white from head to toe and remain in this strange state until a remove curse spell is cast by a cleric of sufficient power. Whether the party accepts the ghost's offer or not, after this gesture it will vanish and the cup will fall to the floor to add its remaining contents to the multitude of stains.
If the door is forced, or the magic dispelled, the corpse face will cry, "Nuromen! Nuromen! Strangers have breached thy maze!"
Of Nuromen's study, right behind that door, incidentally, the study houses a wondrous assortment of tables, books, contraptions, maps, globes, jars of small preserved creatures and appendages, bottles, alchemical apparatus, astrological charts, bones, feathers, and so on. The library is full of historical, alchemical, and scientific tomes, most in a state of complete decay. Spiders and cobwebs are everywhere.
If the party manages to recover this heirloom and restore it to the kingdom of the High Elves, they will thenceforth be known as elf friends.
I like this description of Nuromen's apartments. There is a wardrobe filled with worn and moth-eaten fineries. There are also many finely detailed toys. In fact, there is a magical toy which Nuromen made for his daughter. It is a finely wrought silver puppet which dances and spins by magic when taken from one's pocket and set upon the floor. It is lying on the bed next to the skeleton of a small girl and her nanny. Let's go to the expert delve. It's the expert delve. Our topic for today is how to make bog standard D&D monsters more interesting. I love this topic. It's something that I try to practice in my regular gaming. We're talking about standard, classic monsters, maybe even monsters that are a little flat, like giant rats and things like that. Maybe monsters that we've kind of seen 100 times before. Tom, kick us off here with this discussion. How do we make those things more interesting?
Well, I'm still not sure if I can do anything to help you with giant rats, but apart from that, let's try. I think consideration number one, and arguably maybe the sort of core conjecture of Blue Home as a range of things that you do playing Holmes D&D is maybe don't do anything. Maybe they are actually cool and you just kind of forgot over the years. Sometimes, yeah, just have a dragon. Dragon menacing the village. Go fight a dragon. That's solid, right?
I was thinking the other day, of beholders. My initial thought was, beholders, like, oh God, beholders. Like, I mean, how played out? Is there any more like tropey D&D monster than a beholder? But then I got thinking about, well, why am I so put off by beholders as an interesting monster? Because when I was a kid, I loved beholders. That was my favorite villain character, right? Was a beholder. The reason why is because certain classic D&D monsters especially are oversaturated in a way that like makes them cute or non-threatening or like pop culture things. It's a little bit like Cthulhu.
Yeah.
There were some years like in the early aughts where like everything was Cthulhu, stuffed animals and stuff like that. When you sort of strip away like decades of pop culture baggage from D&D monsters, they can be quite horrifying. And I think the Beholder is a great example. That's fucking horrifying, right? Like a gigantic, a 10-foot diameter ball of flesh with a toothy maw and 10 eye stalks and a big central eye. Just the look of it is horrifying. But then you consider all the things that it does, and it's even more horrifying because it has so many powers. And so, yeah, I'm with you on that. Like, maybe the monsters are more interesting than you remember.
Yeah. And also, actually,
that is a thought.
Yeah, like you mentioned as well, if your group is new to D&D-ish fantasy, there's a good chance they haven't done all this stuff before. For example, I've never been in a game, I don't think I've ever encountered or fought a beholder in a fantasy game, probably because all the GMs, DMs, whatever, had gotten blasé about them and were like, I could do a beholder. Nah. So, I've completely, for me, it would be a new and interesting experience even now. Yeah. So that's one thing to think
Okay, so before we reject the premise entirely of the expert delve today.
Yeah, I do have thoughts about the actual topic. Yeah.
Well, let's say that you do want to make them more interesting. You want to jazz up your bog standard D&D monsters. What do you think?
I'm going to start with a don't. Do not do a quote-unquote twist. All right. This is, I think, a common mistake that's made. Something rotten in Kislev that we discussed in a previous episode suffered from this.
Remember this.
It'd be like, here are some zombies, they're undead, but you didn't expect them to do this slightly different thing, and it's like,
nice.
whatever, man. I don't care. Like, to give a sort of more widely known example, whatever you think about the fast zombies in 28 Days Later, that is zombies that can run. Well, that's it, zombies that can run, right? The interesting thing about them is not whether they're fast or not, right? The interesting thing about them is what happens in the adventure. And so just like saying, they're goblins, but they're fiercely matriarchal, that's sort of interesting maybe, but you can't like make that your thing that you're doing. Do you know what I mean? You can't just like give it a whoops, hey, here's a slight tweak or palette switch on them. That's not going to do it.
Yeah, I think the Something Rotten in Kislev example is great because listeners, you may recall that there's this town that is overrun by undead, but then you get there and you find out it's not overrun by undead. It's like staffed by undead.
Yeah.
All the undead are civically engaged and friendly,
Plowing fields,
Yeah, and it's meant to be like this twist, but it comes off as so stupid. Like, it's the worst part of that module. And it's precisely because, like, it's one thing to make something more interesting or to add your own spin to it, and it's an entirely different thing to go so far as to either be, I don't know, I don't want to say absurd because we're talking about fantasy gaming, and so the concept of absurd doesn't really hold a lot of valence, I don't think.
It's relative, yeah.
But it's so jarring. You're not making a bunch of zombies more interesting by making them civil engineers like they were in Something Rotten in Kislev, right? Or like, you know, helper robots. It was not good. So I think that's what Tom is getting at there. Is that fair, Tom?
Yeah, that's a fair characterization, yeah.
Your twist should be just be careful with your twist.
Yeah.
I think a better twist is the way that the Necromancer is handled in this adventure. This idea of the twist is he wasn't a completely like power mad necromancer. He also had a family that he cared about. That doesn't change the fact that he's still a power mad necromancer, but it at least like gives you like something else to get invested in as far as the story goes. So that's one thing to consider.
Yeah, I think you're right there. In other words, he's got a bit of a motivation. He's not just the stat block for evil necromancer. I think that's important. Quite a few things in Nuromen actually have good motivations, right? So you've got the ghoul guardian who's protecting the treasure, and you meet her in Necropolis and a male one in Maze, I forget which. Anyway, the point is they are guarding this treasure. They're a ghoul now. They used to be the greatest thief in the world, which is a pretty good twist. And they'll talk to you, right? Their motivation is they have to do it, but they don't want to. They'd rather not be killed, but they have to kill you if you try, you know. That's interesting, and it's something you can engage with. And similarly, the goblins that you run into in Nuromen, they're not just kind of sitting around in the feasting hall waiting because they're guarding the dungeon. They're there doing the same thing you're doing. They're the rival investigation team looking for treasure. They're the Belloc to your Indiana Jones, or possibly the other way around. So that's more interesting because it means they're not like a brick wall for you to run into. They're like a rival team going in a similar direction. That, I think, is a good thing to just try and think about. Like, whatever you're putting in. Difficult with the gelatinous cube, I suppose, for example, which basically is a brick wall to run into. But, you know, I think a lot of things, any intelligent NPC, I guess you could do that with, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great advice. If it's possible to give the monster a motivation, you should do so. I mean, I wouldn't say dwell on it, especially if it's a monster that is intended to be cleared out. It's just an obstacle in the chamber. Nuromen provides a good example, like you said, of the goblins, because can there be a more like standard throwaway monster in D&D than a goblin? Probably not. But these goblins have something that's like pushing them. They're like right there alongside you. I think that's what makes them cool. My advice on how to make D&D monsters more interesting, it's really just one piece of advice, but it's a really good piece of advice. And that is never say the monster's name. This is really important. I think what you want to do instead is describe the monster. Describe what the player character sees, and it's going to just have a much more powerful effect. And your players might suss out that it's just a standard monster that they've seen a dozen times before, but at least they're getting to think about it in a new way that makes it more intriguing. So some examples: a dog-sized rodent with glowing red eyes and smelling of rot, I think, is more interesting than giant rat.
Yep.
A squat reptilian creature with a mouthful of razor-sharp teeth and thick leathery hide is more interesting than a troglodyte. It's a straightforward way of making any monster more interesting, but especially a bog standard monster.
That does reward the player who memorized the monster manual as well, because it means they get to in-character go sort of, wait a minute, I've heard of these. They're troglodytes or whatever, you know. And of course, if you've been a bit ambiguous in how you describe them, they might kind of pick the wrong monster, and that'll be fun as well. Like, oh yeah, I think it's a goblin. Oh, actually, it's a hobgoblin. But even so, like, they were knowledgeable based on what they could see, so that's kind of fun. Yeah.
Part of what makes like a really, really like standard or classic D&D monster boring sometimes is that you kind of know everything about them, or you think you know everything about them, or you've seen them so many times that there's no mystery to it.
Yeah.
But like you said, if you describe something that is goblin-like, but isn't super specific about what kind of goblin, well, it keeps the players on their toes a little bit, for one thing. But also, I just think it enriches it, just adds more texture to the whole thing. And it sort of recenters the group into a space that I think fantasy gaming should be in, which is, especially the dungeon crawly sort, which is a kind of horror. It's a type of horror fiction. Some people don't agree with that, but I think if you're going down into dark places where you can't see anything and there's terrifying creatures creeping about in the dark, that's horror. There's a real danger of just flattening all that out if you just say, oh, you see two skeletons. 20 feet away. Or
Yeah.
it just flattens out the whole idea of and feeling of like what a dungeon could be. Any other tips? I have some more, but I'll let you speak.
Let me see. No, I'm sort of thinking more about the horror angle. Because I think if someone says we're doing a horror fantasy, that means a specific thing. But you're right in that any kind of like classic dungeon bashing fantasy, to a degree, it might well be more like Aliens than Alien. But it's got to have that action horror thing to it. Or it's just not that engaging. Yeah, you're right. Flattened out is the phrase. Mm-hmm. You do get those sessions where you're just thinking, oh man, this is all as if we were just doing it like a day at the office, like calculating and not really feeling things. So yeah, there's that.
Well, I like what you said about feeling things, because that actually kind of segues nicely into my next tip, which is after you describe the monster, ask the player how their character feels. It's a quick thing. It can be answered fairly quickly, usually, but it's a nice thing to insert, because what it does is it sort of automatically reframes the player's thinking from their own thoughts and feelings about the monster to their character's thoughts and feelings about the monster. And that's really important, because what makes a bog standard D&D monster bog standard or boring or unexciting is your player's opinion of it. Whereas if you can say, how does your character feel right now after you describe the dog-sized rodent with glowing red eyes smelling of rot? They have to kind of think about, well, what would my character be thinking? And I think that automatically puts them in a frame of mind to treat the monster more seriously.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, a small thing for your toolbox. I guess my last thing, since you and I always joke about rats in the basement. This is probably more of a bog standard first level D&D scenario more than a specific monster, but gosh, could there be anything more dull than rats in a basement? Probably not. However, if you're dealing with rats in a basement, at least find a way, in addition to making the rats more interesting, find a way to make the basement interesting. And I guess what I mean to say is part of making standard D&D monsters more interesting, or standard D&D encounters more interesting, is making the environment of the scenario more interesting. Presumably, you are clearing out the basement for a family or some sort of merchant or something. Take that opportunity to pose a few questions to the players about what they see in the basement and how that reflects the people who own the basement. I think anytime you can add that kind of texture to a scene, you can make what would otherwise be a pretty throwaway encounter or throwaway scenario a lot better. And so here's where my paint the scene technique comes in, because if you think beforehand about the basement and maybe some questions you can pose to the players that explore a certain idea connected to the basement, it just enriches the whole thing. It just makes it a much more interesting environment.
I did have one more thing to talk about, which is to do with environments. Yeah. One of the things about a classic OSRE thing to do is to encourage thinking around a problem. So in the case of a family basement, maybe you've got stuff you want to not break. So you can make it into a physical puzzle part as well. Bringing it back to Aliens, you've got to go into that under the floor thing, but no guns, because you'll blow stuff up. And yeah, I think one thing you could do with the bog standard monster is put it in the wrong environment, which might be the Barrier Peaks gambit of, having science fiction things in a fantasy setting, or the other way around. But it could be something more subtle than that. For example, a largely foresty creature that is in an urban setting, and therefore, is hard to predict, or you have to deal with things in a different way than you would, if you're fighting a giant in a forest clearing, that's one thing. Fighting a giant in a crowded street is another. And so that's an interesting thing to do, is to take them away from the default encounter table location and put them somewhere else.
Yeah, because their presence inspires questions.
Yeah, exactly.
You want to know how this monster ended up here. I mean, it kind of goes back to something we've talked about before, which is, we've talked about this in the context of horror gaming, which is sometimes what makes things scary or exciting is when your veil of expectations has been pierced. Like, if you have a certain expectation about a place, if you have a certain expectation of safety or a certain expectation of what types of things you expect to find, something that like interrupts that or pierces that or sort of like shakes that notion up, it has more impact. I don't think you can do this all the time.
No, because then by definition, it wouldn't be unexpected. Yeah, it's a delicate balance must be struck, I guess.
Yeah, because at a certain point, like, you also just might look like a hack as a GM, right? It's like, oh, you don't really know what goes where, right?
Yeah.
But more dangerously, I think, is just the fact that you kind of, you want to pull your tricks out. You want to use them sparingly, right? And I think that's a good one, though. Yeah, so that was good. Nice little list of tips and tricks for making D&D monsters and encounters more interesting. Some bog standard ones anyway. Anything else you want to say?
No, it's all good for me. Let's do some companion adventures.
It's the companion adventures. I want to start real quick by just saying, I want to nudge again the idea that I am running most of my OSR stuff publicly right now this year. I'm committed to doing it. And so you can watch my 3-session playthrough of the Maze of Neuromin on my YouTube channel. It's a pretty good one. It's a good example, first of all, of how to use Maze of Neuromin in Trophy Gold, a really classic D&D module in Trophy Gold. And also, it's kind of an interesting series because, like I mentioned earlier, the players, they were not well versed in D&D-isms. And so it's kind of fun that they fell for like all the classic D&D traps and stuff, you know?
Oh, excellent.
like the skeleton floating towards you, but it's actually a gelatinous cube. But that little trick, they totally fell for that. So yeah, so if you want to go see some adventures doing classic D&D sort of for the first time in a way, worth doing. What do you got, Tom?
Yeah, I've got a gaming recommendation, which is to delve into the history of Holmes D&D, kind of, and check out, well, this is difficult because it's a dungeon often referred to as the Tower of Xenopus. That's Zen as in the Buddhist sect, Opus as in Magnum. But when it was originally published in the D&D book, it was just called The Sample Dungeon, so a little tricky to track down in that sense. But there is a website/blog called Xenopus Archives, which is great for doing all these kind of dives into the design of just this one sample dungeon, and like, you know, sometimes expanding on it or whatever, but looking at the way it's put together, the fact that it has these sort of 3 different, like what the author calls theme park zones, you know, Undead Land in the north, Wizard World in the south, and Pirate Land in the west, and like the way that all works and why it works so well. That's really worth checking out, and you'll see some of the things that Holmes himself, was it Eric Holmes, wrote in that sample dungeon, and you'll see that in Nuromen as well. So yeah, definitely worth exploring that.
Fabulous. You have a book recommendation. Tell us about that.
Oh, well, I mean, it's not like the most amazingly original recommendation. It's The Hobbit, because, you know, what happens if you take a melancholy, crumbling setting, then have happy-go-lucky adventures in it? The Hobbit happens. It's like a bog standard monsters. They're fun anyway. Trolls, dragons. It also features way too many PCs, like 1970s D&D games. So, yeah, it's... I mean, I'm not saying you need to go and read it, because you've probably read it already. I'm just saying remember it, and then think, oh, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Let's do music. We both have some synthwave options here, I see.
Back into the synthwave. It's been a while, yeah.
Yeah, it's been a minute. I have one called 1983 Main Theme by Sonoya Caves. Never heard of them before. Just found it on a Spotify playlist, but I really love it. It's one of those really nice, like, kind of menacing, mysterious 1980s fantasy movie soundtrack type pieces of music, and I really dug it. I think it's a good fit for this.
Cool. Yeah, my recommendation is maybe technically not synthwave. I think it might be more like dreamy synth pop from the Ukraine. The artist is Luna, as in the moon, and I especially recommend from her album, hang on, I'm going to have to read the Ukrainian now, Ostrov Savodu. Don't worry, you can just look for the tracks. One is called a Hooligan, which is the letter that looks like an X, the one that looks like a Y. Never mind. The next one I'm going to recommend is titled in English, thankfully, and that's called Jukebox. So, yeah, look for Jukebox by Luna. And, yeah, they're these sort of... This is less about the dungeon theme, movie soundtrack, and more about the kind of melancholy elves that are in the background of the adventure.
Listeners, we'll have links in the show notes, but spoiler alert, we won't. We never do. Yeah. We say that, we never do it. I have a podcast recommendation, which is Monster Man. I think we've talked about Monster Man before. I'm fairly certain we have. Yeah. You've been a guest on it, if I recall correctly.
I have.
And James Holloway's terrific podcast where he goes through the monster manual and other manuals at this point, I think, and goes a deep dive on each monster, right? It's very entertaining, and we're talking about making monsters more interesting. This is a great place to sort of get some inspiration, I think. And listeners, that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find us on Twitter at GauntletRPG. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. We're on Patreon. It's patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you to our extemporaneous editor, Rich Rogers. Yeah, that one's not so great. Thanks, listeners.
Thanks, listeners. Bye. Hi listeners, I want to let you know about Codex Starlight 2, the newest issue of our indie role-playing game magazine, coming to the Gauntlet Patreon feed in early March. Codex Starlight 2 is one of the biggest and best issues yet, and it features Snipe Hunt, an original game inspired by movies like Red Dawn and Invasion of the Body Snatchers, in which a teenager takes a group of kids out into the woods for a snipe hunt in order to protect them from a calamity taking place in the town they live in. Bed, Breakfast, and Beyond, a one-shot hack of Brindlewood Bay about an elderly gay couple who run a bed and breakfast trying to figure out why guests keep disappearing from room 3. The Temple of the Peerless Star, a trophy gold incursion inspired by the dungeon made famous in the Discern Realities podcast and later published for Dungeon World in the original Codex Starlight. We've taken the core of that dungeon and expanded it for trophy gold, and it's great. 3 dozen more signs the stars are right, a miscellaneous sequel, 7 original illustrations, and a custom layout. You can get Codex Starlight 2 in the Gauntlet Patreon feed in March by making a $6 pledge. That's at patreon.com/gauntlet. Thanks.